Hello, I'm Marina Todeschini from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And first, I want to thank you, the LAII, for this great opportunity, this great scholarship, this great help, and not just for the PhD, but also for the MA. I got my MA here with you guys, and it has been a pleasure. And it's a little bit bittersweet to say to be in my last semester right now, but what a great ride it was to be part of the LAII. So thank you for everyone, staff and professors, everyone. So I'm gonna be talking to you today about a couple of chapters of my dissertation and my PhD dissertation. So it's on female crossing and urban mobility in Latin American literature. So let's start. Okay, so starting at the beginning, why do we study cultural productions? Or maybe why do I study cultural productions, right? Why do we grab those books and we look them deep and we try to find meaning to them, right? My background actually is not in literature, and I got it from here at the LAII in political science and communications. So when I first started this PhD, to make this connection was very different to me, and this was the bigger question. And throughout the years, this has been the great question for me, the big question. And I think it's not just mine, probably we all have our own doubts about our work, right? And so this work, just to start this work, it's about finding connections between classroom, social practice, and cultural productions. So it's not, so you're not going to see it, especially here in this presentation, you're not going to see it a detailed reading of those books, of those literary pieces. You are going to see instead me trying to make connections between the texts and social practices, and how we can apply this in a meaningful teaching of language and literature in the classroom. So let's start. Just giving a quick a summary of my whole dissertation. So I'm talking about trespassing and transcending marginal and feminine crossing and urban mobility in Latin American literature. So I explore current Latin American works written in the USA mostly, that deal with border crossing, geographically and symbolic, imposed because of one's ethnicity, race, and gender. So these works, they do it. So they do this crossing through special mappings. These authors represent a very real human desire of exploring, traveling, belonging, and fleeing injustice. In times where walls are being built, these stories are tools of resistance, and that's what I argue in this whole work. They are the intersection between art and politics, and means to construct a more inclusive geography to all. However, in this presentation, I'm going to go over two of my chapters that deal with feminine crossing, mapping, and urban movement of women in literary works produced in the US by Latin American female writers. So these women are going to be finding their spaces not only the US, but inside the urban centers, and affirming their right to exist, to occupy, and to be here. So throughout history, literary stories have embodied human spaces and interactions, confirming the importance of territory in the construction of subjectivities and identities. I defend that these Latin American authors that choose to narrate newcomers, and by that I mean these immigrant women coming to the United States, characters' mobility through the city, they are aware of that political power of space. They use the metropolis as the ground for the performance of their belonging of an entire collective of people systematically previously excluded from these spaces. Edward Soja says that making geographies always start with occupancy, sorry for that, or with the body presence and the performance of the self in the public sphere. While space and the right to the city are fundamental concepts for my analysis, I actually chose to focus primarily on cultural texts that present the movement of characters through the spaces as a claim to their urban rights. By that, I mean that the characters in the books that I analyze, they travel through the city areas that historically have not been inclusive to them. For example, the immigrant, the black young female, and the low-income brown bodies traveling, mapping, and ensuring their belonging on sidewalks and in the public places. The characters in these stories are not limited because of who they are. So the marginal, the female, the black, the brown, the immigrant, they're not restricted to their domestic realm, neither to their neighborhoods, and by that I mean the barrios or the favelas, but instead they're lifted as part of the human fabric. I argue that these characters' physical mobility and crossing of the border at another level for the understanding of shaping constructing urban spaces. By reading literary works that deviate from the typical urban narration of white middle-class male society gains other views of the urban space. With that diversification of the public areas, we also humanize and accept the other as deserving of the same space as us. The different subject that before was invasive becomes in these novels also worth of belonging to these spaces instead. The basic main theoretical approach I use to explain the politics of movement is, of course, pedestrian enunciation by Desserteau, where he states that the act of human passage becomes a process of appropriation and transformation of space itself. The author affirms that locomotion is a form of expression and enunciation. And to enforce this idea, I look at Francesco Cahetti's when he defends that walking as a social disorder or a person's social liberation from spaces and hierarchies that restrict them. The act of narrating the movement of previous marginalized characters in the urban areas is a statement that their passage makes a mark and constructs the city space, as well as shows autonomy and liberation from hierarchical imposed segregations. Jenny Donovan also works with the same concept by stating that when we design, build, manage, occupy, or even just pass through a place, we change it. And this is the main idea here too. The author understands that bodies are carriers of meaning in a physical mass that transforms physical spaces. New ways to design cities, in the author's opinion, should not anymore fit simply the capitalistic market ruled by white privileged men. In other words, metropolitan areas should not be designed simply for upper and middle class car owners, but instead it should help people meet their needs, thrive, and fulfill their potential. All the works that I choose for this dissertation as my primary texts, they use the symbolic and physical idea of challenging barrier segregation, and however, I focus on detailed analysis of text that uses physical mobility to express a symbolic inclusion of these newcomers into these new urban centers. I argue that by narrating transit and territory knowledge, these authors are claiming the right of previously marginalized groups to access as well to shape the society and the city space they are inserted to. By reconstructing the city as a text through narratives, they are creating a more inclusive urban scenario. The transpassing and transcending in these works always comes filled with meaning of breaking symbolic and physical social stagnations. The body and the urban movement goes beyond its physicality, and I'm going to go far into that when I talk about the primaries. So I argue that these new protagonists in the contemporary text that I am looking are a new type of flanu, actually the flanus. The flanu is usually a literary character associated with a very specific social class, gender, and race. This male character was first found in Europe texts from the 19th century, and he had access to all city areas, so he doesn't actually have a goal or a destination. He's not rushed to work or restricted by any type of segregation. He's actually very free to map and to narrate the city as he wishes, signs that confirm his social class and his social privileges. In this sense, he represents the upper class white male gaze of our metropolis, and for a long time he was the only one found in literature. In the beginning of the 19th century, one of the favorite activities of white upper-class males was the ritual of walking, watching and being watched, which is very important in this text, in the streets, right? So in cities like Paris or London or even New York and Rio de Janeiro, the wealthy male residents would perform their identities by displaying their best clothes in the best manner. This practice gave room to a set of repressive rules against not just women, but actually people from other races too. So in the same time, middle and upper class women were expected to use the sidewalk with the purpose, different from the white male, which had the privilege of being the flanus. Uh, while white male men displayed their best image, white women had to remain as invisible as possible. So going from one place to the other and not just enjoying the sidewalks, they had to be quiet and private and use special gowns that would cover them. Women that walked in the streets without such gowns, which can be connected or related to poor class women, were immediately recognized as not having morals and values, or street women. This constructed images enforced already strong stereotypes about the womanhood and the value of black and brown women everywhere, since they needed to walk to work and they did not possess money to invest in those mentals, right? They were often perceived as sinful. In the sense, when white privileged men allowed women to stroll on streets without comment, that reflected a respect to their subjectivity. And when they would call them out, it meant that they were deserving of it because of their social and acceptable display in public. Interesting, huh? It's something that we see till this day, right? So this practice is still very much present in modern society, and now we call, and as this picture show, catcalling, where men affirm their hierarchy in social conservative norms that expect women to actually behave and stroll quietly and covered in public areas. Things started to change in the beginning of the 20th century when women excuse me, occupied the streets as consumers and workers. However, the introduction of these new female bodies in the metropolis took a very different characteristic, and women walkers now were connected with the idea of consumerism in big commercial centers. We had another problem building, another constructed image built of women that stands very still strong until today, right? That they were not observers, they were instead consumers, a stereotype that is still very much connected to the idea of female urban mobility now. So fortunately, things did change, and now women are part of the social fabric. However, we are restricted to these stereotypes and this historical previous ideas of women in the sidewalk and in the urban space. And in the dissertation, I go more into this whole idea of private and public sphere, right? But here we don't have time for it. Some of these, so we see the flanus in literature. Some examples I have here in this slideshow: The House on Mango Street, Maria or Poncia Vicencio in A Hora da Estrela by Clarice Lispector. So what is different from these previous works to the works that I am analyzing now is this: in these works you still see the stagnation. So you do have characters that move around the urban areas and they do narrate the urban areas, but they also show the stagnation. They suffer a lot, so they are restricted symbolically and geographically a lot of times. And they are, for example, if you look at A House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, you have this idea where Esperanza is in her barrio a lot, and there's she doesn't leave the book until the end. So in the end, she has this liberation. However, there's a lot of tragedy going with her when she decides to get out of that safe space of her barrios in her house, right? So the main idea of the House of Mango Street is Esperanza sitting in front of her house, right? Talking to other women and socializing, but riding the steps right in front of her house. We also see in the same book, we see numerous characters that actually, female characters that watch their lives through the windows. They just don't leave the house because they can, because they still restricted to that domestic environment. Um, so so we have this in all these works, this binary, right, that they have to fight. And something very present in all this previous works are the tragic end. So we see it in all of them. One example is A Hora da Estrela by Clarice Lispector. So if you look at that book, by the end of the book, what happens to Macabea is she's run over by a car. So the public area expels her, right, or kills her. So again, in this new works that I'm discussing here, the newcomer. So the newcomer is the flanus, right? She's the one that narrates, that maps, and owns the city areas. So the urban areas as a claim for the right to the city, this narration as a claim for the right to the city. The sidewalk becomes political when they walk and perform their subjectivity, and they have the power, the power to occupy, to explore, to use, and to stroll through and construct their urban spaces in their areas. So I look at these three books in these three flanus. In chapter one, I look at Esperanza Box of Saints by author Maria Amparo Escaldón, a Mexican-born American citizen. So in this text, Esperanza is a Mexican woman living in a conservative small town close to Tijuana. She lost her husband years ago. She knows how to behave like a perfect old-fashioned widow, takes care of her teenager daughter, and she also lives with her sister-in-law, which is also a widow. However, Esperanza's world is transformed when she is faced with the mysterious death of her only daughter, Blanca. Balancing on the thin line between life and fantasy and sanity and craziness, the reader receives a divine message on her stove. So she's cooking, and where she spends a lot of her days, and she sees this message in the stove that her daughter's still alive, and it was sold in the border. In a border between Mexico and the United States in a prostitution deal. So Esperanza packs her luggage, which is a box of saints, and crosses the Mexican-American border in search of her daughter and her own self-recreation. During this quest, she constructs new spaces for women in between countries and cultures, between the pure and the sinful, and between the public and the private. Esperanza's independent movement through the new urban spaces empowers her story and her subjectivity, and in the end, she's liberated from the places of her oppression, symbolically and geographically. She not only finds her new self in her daughter, but also her sexuality. In this book, I add the importance of a female movement in an immigrant narrative, constructing her own desired path and developing herself as a sexual being. I also focus on her liberation from rural Mexican patriarchy tradition during her journey and her previous domestic reality, in contrast with her conquest of public spaces. In chapter 2, I look at two books, two Caribbean American books, American Street and Dominicana. So in American Street by Ibi Zoboi, the protagonist Fabiola is a Haiti-American teenager who was born in the USA but raised in Haiti because of her mother's immigration status. When they decide to come back to America, they're challenged with the family separation, a theme extremely relevant in current American politics. The two female characters in this test represent the contrast. So we have this duality again of stagnation and movement. The daughter is in the free urban movement, and her mother is incarcerated and in an immigration detention center. So Fabiola stays with an aunt and a cousin in Detroit and quickly quickly has to learn how to negotiate her American citizenship and her Haitian heritage. She becomes a hybrid character that builds her own space in between cultures, languages, and spaces. At the end of the novel, after a big adventure through the streets of Detroit, Fabiola saves her family, sets her mother free, and becomes a woman as well as an American citizen. In the last work, Dominicana, um, Dominican is a very strong construction of a newcomer as a flanus. So this book by Angie Cruz, I see this text together because they're both coming from Caribbean American authors. So they it's a the protagonist in this narrative is Anna, and she's 15 years old Dominicana that arrives in the USA after marrying a much older man. In the first part of the novel, we have the stagnation. So Anna watches life as passes it through the window, very similar to the house on Mango Street, so in New York City. So she's entrapped and abused by her husband. But the first stagnation contrasts with the freedom that Anna achieves in the second part of the book when her husband leaves for a trip. So she's alone to explore the urban life and experience the streets. In this process, Anna studies, works, falls in love, and becomes a woman. In the end similar to American Street, Anna achieves her independence and frees herself from her family, from her husband's oppression, and the geographic challenge posed by them. And I apologize for the spoilers. I should have said it before, right? So all these books, all these three books have in common terms like border, crossing, street names, numbers, directions, moving corners, urban exploration. So they used all of these elements. The inclusion of urban movement in these narratives is a way to reclaim social and physical space of these women, different from the previous narratives where violence and segregation and the disenfranchisement of subjects was shown. In these works, actually, the authors choose to introduce the newcomers or these women immigrants, right, into the center of the city areas, letting them transit freely in between spaces. So again, they're not restricted to these barrios. They're not restricted to the tragedy of their lives. They are actually out and about, mapping, discovering. There's a lot of, so in the three books we have these women possess maps. So they open the maps, they look at them, they discover the city alone, in the beginning. So they learn this. So they have this knowledge over their territory, and with that they ensure their power over it, right? But why are those stories important, right? That's the big question. Like I said it in the beginning, why is it important to claim this women's movement belonging in the urban areas? So the idea here, and it's to belong in they belong in the streets, and they have this ownership over space. They have the right to the city, which includes the right to construct, the right to occupy, the right to be there. They are immigrants, they are brown, they are black, but they have the right to be in these places and have voice. And this is transferred, right? In the moment you have the right to be there and the right to construct, you also have voice over the political process, or you should have voice over the political process of making common spaces. And that's where we're gonna, this is the key to understand class discussion of literary pieces, in my opinion, right? We need to go further. We need to apply them. How can we use this? How can we use our experiences into building? I don't want to. I don't want to say citizenship here, but because there's not the idea of citizenship. It's the idea of human rights, right? The right to transit and to move and to belong. But why do we need to think about the feminine and the female body when we talk about cities? Are cities built for men and by men? And this is the time of the conversation that I opened for you guys to talk a little bit, but now I cannot do it, right? So yes, cities are built for men and by men. But what does that mean? So so it's very important for us to discuss this in the classroom. Part of the debate is to understand why male urbanism exists and how can we reclaim it, and And a part of the urban planning, they empower students to understand themselves as active agents of the urban fabric. So to understand this idea about social practice and literature, I read a lot of um, architecture books, and these are some of them you have there. So we have Janet Jacobs with the Death and Life of Great American Cities. Another book that I would like um, to mention here is The Compassionate City by Jenny Donovan. So all these ideas here are not just mine. So just wanted to make sure we cite them. So when we see these characters, and when we started discussing them and thinking about what they represent, we started seeing how the city is actually built for men and by men. But what does it mean to actually shift that to have a feminist city in a city for women? So in here, just a small observation. I am talking about a city for women here, but I do go into there's obviously the women is also not made for minorities. It's also not made for people with special needs. So it needs to be inclusionary to everyone, not just women. But here is my example, right? Of my work. So we talk about why women are a lot of times restricted to their private sphere instead of and men to the public, right? And there are very strong historical foundations to that, but um, we always fall back into the safety. It's not safe for women. Women don't feel safe in public, and so we think about, oh, a feminist city. It's a city where women are safe. Yes, it is, but there's a lot more to it, right? So just some practical examples here, just again to shift this idea of theory and literature to practice. So yes, a city for women would be a safe city in all areas during day and night. It would be a street, for example, where street lights are placed in according to how women feel. For example, there's research that shows that women feel more comfortable with yellow light than white light, right? These things need to be thought out and consulted with with females too. Resting safe areas. So, for example, again, there's research that shows that men are more likely to sit and play in benches in parks or just the street to observe urban life, and women instead use the street and the sidewalk as going from place A to B. So just transportation, just passing instead of actually enjoying that space. Affordable and accessible daycare in commercial areas. So we need to accept that women still has more of a role, more than men, of caregivers, right? Of children and seniors. So women need to be able to go to work and have a 15-minute break and check on their kids, right? Especially the small ones. Thriving feminist art, very important. And I have a picture there of Marielle. So music, media, and cultural scenes. So women need to see themselves on the street like men does, right? So another good example is parks, streets should be named after prominent women, which we now, can anyone remember a street name with the name of a woman, right? It's a very rare thing, which is unacceptable, right? Another small things, I have some pictures here. I put that picture there of a bar because it's something that I remember. So reading all those feminist urbanism architecture books, they were talking about Latin American bars, right? So it is true. And I remember growing up with that. I had to go from my house to the padaria, and I had to go really fast, and I couldn't, he was not enjoying the scene. He was like going, buying bread and coming back. And there was a bar like that on the way, and I had to cross this, and my mom would make me cross the busy street, and I had to cross the busy street by myself so I wouldn't get and cross through the middle of all those men in the bar. So that's an architect, that is a city built for man by man, right? That allows that type of things. Another thing is that I like that picture of the I don't remember what the name of the place that men pee, but and it says women pee here too. So, uritorius. Right? I don't know. But it says women pee here too. So it's absurd that you will create a type of geography like that, architecture like that, where you just give the chance to men to pee in public, right? And not women. And so here are just some small examples that if we stop and think about our city, Albuquerque, yes, it's also built for men. And how is it? And how can we appropriate it and be part of the construction of the city area? So how can those ideas fit the language and literature classroom? Just a little bit of what I do in Portuguese 311. Portuguese 311 is an advanced Portuguese class that works with writings of resistance. So we work with cultural productions that resist the social injustice we experience. So we look at Black voices, voices of resistance, Indigenous voices of resistance, LGBTQ, and feminist voices. And we look at all kinds of cultural productions. So books, but also short stories, poetry, music, movies, social gatherings, everything, right? And so the idea here is now could mapping be a cultural production? And absolutely, right? So here at UNM, we have especially these Portuguese classes, we have a very diverse demographics. Our students normally they are a Spanish major, they do have Hispanic heritage, and they come to us because they have a requirement for their major, right? Why is it important now to work with this type of students and in this idea of urban rights and right to the city? I was in actually orientation a few months ago before all this COVID-19 started, right? And we had an auditorium full of high school students. And one of the professors called that was going to talk about scholarships for them to this high school students. She said, I don't really remember the words right now, but she said something about oh yeah, that's what she said. She said, I want to see all your brown faces, your beautiful brown faces here next fall, because you belong here. And I thought that was extremely important to understand this whole concept. So a lot of times we feel displaced. We feel displaced because of her heritage. We feel displaced because of our accents. We feel displaced because we don't feel like we belong in the place that we are in. And how important it is to state to those students that yes, they belong in this space. This place is theirs. They have ownership of it. And with that, the understanding of their urban and civil rights and urban rights, right? I do have the right to, it doesn't matter if I am an immigrant, if my parents are immigrants, I do deserve to be here, and I do have rights by being here. So we used to, sorry, I went a little bit of a tangent here. The language classroom, we used to worry about certain things in a language classroom. So we used to think about speaking, reading, writing, listening, and then after some years ago, we introduced that a cultural competence. So those were actual standards, right? So we were worried about all those things, right? This was what the language classroom was about. However, things have been changing, and nowadays we're looking not just in the language classroom, but all classrooms. We're looking at other things like communication, which embraces all those previous concepts, but also diversity, social responsibility, and critical thinking. So that's what we're trying to do in the three level Portuguese, but also on the 200 level, in the 100 level, right? This is very important to start since the beginning. And why not, right? All those we do have to think of our students as critical thinkers, and they really are. We are not there to simply teach them grammar. We're there to make them think using another language, and they think about and think in them thinking about their urban rights. It's something very important too. So to give some examples of how this can be done in the classroom, there's this amazing project called Border Autosay, and it's an online blog or web page, right, that traces the border of Mexico and the United States. And it gives you, as you can see on the right, you have the list of sister cities, and then you have stories in each one of them, but it's not stories, but it's the story about the place, okay, not about the people in the place, but the story about the space that it's in. And it's, let me see if I can click on here. Well, I can, but anyways, if you are interested about it, you should definitely click on the link and go listen to some of these stories. They're fascinating. So again, in this work, in this project, we're actually mapping this location according not to a hierarchy, not to a government narrative, nothing like that, but according to personal narratives. We're constructing this place as our own and claiming it for its people. So my idea before COVID-19, right, which will be implemented eventually, but this gave a little bit of a turn to my dissertation project. But anyways, the project is here. Just it hasn't been put in practice yet. But the classroom practice would look a little bit like this. So the first idea is we read those texts and we debate them and we understand what it means and we understand how they're mapping the cities. And some activities include, for example, construct a map, draw a map of that paragraph, right? How does that city look like? How is Fabiola and Ana and Esperanza narrating their cities? After that, mapping through experiences. So you would be a speaking activity where we have the critical thinking. So you can see it there. So each student includes a small narrative in the map, claiming their place for their own, and how they narrating their experience, or how that place belongs to them. So we have this production of narratives, right? And after actively occupying and thinking about social responsibility. So with that, we would be developing a sense of belonging and ownership in students. So there's this great project in Brazil, in south of Brazil. The person that works on it actually was my classmate in college. So that's how I know about it, but it's called Curativos Urbanos. So she works with her class with band-aids, okay? So they make band-aids and they write things on it, and they glue it or they stamp it to sidewalks, as you can see it, where they see problems, where they see there's a need for violence, or there's a light bulb that went out. So again, here you see how they are marking it, right? They're marking it, the territory they're going through, and the problems that they see, and how they want that fixed it, and they're claiming that territory again. And here I just have a small example of how mapping would work in a classroom, and how students would create narratives, citing places in Albuquerque, and how they transit through the spaces, how they occupy the spaces. So as you can see, each piece of paper is one of the students' poetries or short stories about the places they've been, and a little places of interaction, or things they've seen or things they experienced. and to teachers, I probably don't have to say that, or professor instructors, but of course here we are working with this idea of speaking, writing, reading practices, right? Okay, so just some final thoughts before we're over. Through these narratives that include previously marginalized bodies, and here I mean the immigrant women, into the urban fabric, moving freely, we can empower our students to understand themselves as also part of the same spaces. We're actually pushing them to affirm their belonging, their knowledge, and their power over their territory. But most important, we're hopefully inspire them to be political agents and constructors of the city they live in. We're pushing them to concept to the concept that the city should be a space that not only welcomes everyone and all of us, but also serves us. Geography must be inclusive, and in the classroom should also be a space for the understanding of diversity, social responsibility, and critical thinking. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much the LAII for this great opportunity. If you have any questions, comments, you can email me, and thank you. Stay safe.